Welcome to Melbourne Law School's live webinar series we're running on law in the time of COVID-19. And the aim of this series is really to bring the expertise of Melbourne Law School scholars and expert colleagues, such as to today, to discuss the legal dimensions of this really extraordinary health, economic and social crisis. My name's Hilary Charlesworth, and I teach here at Melbourne Law School and also at the ANU. What I'm planning to do is to introduce three wonderful panelists and the topic for today in a moment. But I first would like to begin by acknowledging that today we're meeting on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I pay my respects to the Wurundjeri elders, past and present, and to the traditional custodians of other lands from which you may join us today. Let me also acknowledge and welcome our academic community, alumni, students and friends of the law school. And it's really wonderful to have the Melbourne Law School community come together at this very strange and puzzling time. Well, the COVID-19 era poses many challenges for human rights, and these include issues such as freedom of expression, freedom of movement, and the rights to life and the rights to health. Many authoritarian governments have indeed seized on the pandemic to restrict civil and political rights in the name of community safety. Just last month, the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, said, and I'm quoting from a policy paper of his, he said, "The COVID-19 pandemic is a public health emergency, but it is far more. It's an economic crisis, a social crisis, and a human crisis that's fast becoming a human rights crisis." He also pointed out, which many other people have, that while the virus doesn't discriminate, its effects do. The type of measures we've been encouraged to take here in Australia, such as social distancing, lengthy hand washing practices, these are simply impossible for many people around the world. In Australia, responses to the pandemic have encountered questions of restrictions of civil and political rights, as well as the exacerbation of social and economic inequalities. So we might ask, well, what protection do human rights standards offer in the COVID era, and what gaps in human rights law does the pandemic reveal? To help us analyse these very complex issues, I'm calling on the expertise of the panel with us today. And I'm really delighted to welcome three internationally recognised experts in human rights. First of all, Elaine Pearson, who's the Australia Director of the very well-known international NGO Human Rights Watch. Then we have Manne, the Executive Director of Refugee Legal, and who does teaching at Melbourne Law School and is on a number of boards there. And my Melbourne Law School colleague, John Tobin, who's the Francine McNiff Professor of Human Rights Law. So I'd really like to welcome and thank them very much. I should say that this event is live and it's being recorded, and parts of it may be published later on. What I plan to do is to start by asking our panelists to discuss what they see as significant human rights issues in the COVID era, and then open it up to your questions. So we really would like to encourage you to ask questions of our panel, and we ask you to submit any questions through the Q&A function on Zoom, which is at the bottom of your screen. And then those questions are going to be moderated by Dr. Shane Chalmers, one of my colleagues, and Abigail Parker, who's in the Melbourne Law School communications team, and they'll moderate the questions and collate them, and then we'll put them to the panelists as time allows. So you're welcome to start firing questions through the Q&A function at any time. So, and the plan is, after a sort of general discussion among the panelists, I'm hoping that we'll have at least half an hour for questions at the end. So then, to begin, so the big question is, well, what human rights issues are raised by the pandemic? And I might start with you, Elaine to talk us through some of those issues, perhaps particularly focusing on regional and international issues. Over to you.
Thank you, Hilary, and thanks for giving Human Rights Watch an opportunity to share some of our thoughts today. I mean, obviously there's a whole plethora of human rights concerns that are raised when a pandemic of this proportion hits. And I think it's important to remember that where there is a public health emergency like this, obviously governments are entitled to take restrictions on certain rights. But it's very important that those restrictions are necessary, are proportionate, are lawful, and are time-bound. And unfortunately, what we've seen in some countries in our region, you know, for example, Cambodia, the Philippines, we've seen leaders there really use the attention around the coronavirus to really give themselves arbitrary and unlimited, broader sweeping powers. And that is really a concern for Human Rights Watch. So there's a whole range of, you know, human rights violations, but I think some of the issues that we've been particularly working on are freedom of expression and access to information. This is really essential in a crisis. We've also looked at issues around abuses during lockdowns and quarantines. And we've also looked at things particularly around people who are more vulnerable in a public health crisis like this. So people in custody, in prisons, in immigration detention centres, also in aged care facilities. So maybe just touching on the first couple of those, you know, firstly, I guess around access to information. Obviously China, you know, where the pandemic started, we saw efforts by the government there to really censor and suppress information in the early stages when there was very little information coming out from this pandemic. So, you know, people may remember the case of Dr. Lee, the doctor who had shared information, you know, simply on the equivalent of a WhatsApp group with his medical classmates around the virus, and he was hauled in for questioning by police. We know that cases like that, you know, have continued to be reported in China. We know of, you know, several citizen journalists who've been arbitrarily detained, effectively disappeared because of the videos and the content that they had been uploading to the internet during this crisis, and other cases of journalists and activists who were compiling information that was censored by the Chinese government, who've also faced repercussions. So, you know, we're particularly concerned that during a time of crisis, actually the government, you know, should be encouraging access to accurate, timely information rather than censoring that type of content. And in Asia, what we've noticed is that, you know, particularly there's been a use of fake news laws to really target journalists, bloggers, in some cases healthcare workers, again, who are sharing information about the pandemic, particularly where it's critical of how the government has responded. So in Cambodia, for instance, we've seen more than 30 people already arrested under fake news laws, and a number of those people include opposition politicians. In Thailand, people have also faced repercussions where they've reported on, you know, the inadequate personal protective equipment that healthcare workers have faced. And then in places like the Philippines, we've also reported on some of the abuses related to lockdowns. So there, Duterte, you know, who already has, you know, a very abusive human rights record related to the tens of thousands of people who've been killed in the war on drugs, he's effectively given very sweeping broad powers to law enforcement to round up people who are abusing the lockdown rules and the curfews. And we've seen children, you know, in some cases put in dog cages. In one particularly egregious case, children were put in a coffin, actually, in the Philippines. In other cases, young people have been stripped naked, walked through the town in order to shame them for breaking the lockdown. And the jails have basically been filling up in the Philippines with, you know, more people, which obviously is a public health concern. Because of, you know, these very arbitrary rules around the lockdown. So these are, you know, a few of the issues that we've been working on, particularly in this region, related to sort of human rights abuses in this crisis.
Great. Many thanks, Elaine. David, what about, from your perspective, what are the big human rights issues that have been revealed so far?
Yes, well, look, thanks, Hilary, and again, thank you very much for the invitation to be on the panel today. Look, the pandemic, of course, is a global phenomenon, and it's an unprecedented crisis and a global public health emergency, but with certain particularly vulnerable groups at risk. And I wanted to focus on one of those groups, and that is asylum seekers, refugees and migrants. It is a global crisis with global, regional and local and national dimensions. And I wanted to just briefly touch on each of those. In all of those dimensions, they're all underpinned by a common theme, and that is that effectively that vulnerabilities have been exacerbated. Effectively, the pandemic has exacerbated vulnerability of those most vulnerable, and those with the least protections already. So firstly, to go to the global phenomenon in relation to asylum seekers, refugees and migrants. And I think what we see there is has been powerfully distilled in a recent UN report, which you've referred to. And it's the report is called "We're All in This Together." And if I could just draw upon that report and some of the really important observations of it in summary, really, from a global perspective, that migrants, refugees and internally displaced people are particularly vulnerable to stigma, to xenophobia, to hate speech and racism. They're facing across the globe job losses, discrimination, even difficulty with returning home due to border closures. 167 countries have closed their borders, and 57 of those countries have actually refused access to people seeking asylum. Many have been turned back or deported to danger. Many are trapped in cramped, overcrowded conditions without access to basic or adequate healthcare or sanitation, and are at acute risk of infection. Many have been excluded from mainstream social distancing policies and other safety measures that apply to the mainstream populations. Many, including undocumented people, may not have been able to access medical treatment, and that is often due to fears, and we're seeing this in Australia too, due to fears of being excluded, detained or deported. In other words, fears that accessing healthcare could result in punishment, and including severe punishment. I'll just now touch upon the regional dimension, and that is in our region. And the global phenomenon has unfolded with, I think, fair to say, some particularly disturbing or egregious scenarios. And one particularly stark example is the situation of Malaysia recently having pushed back to sea some boats carrying hundreds of Rohingya refugees seeking asylum, with deadly consequences. Hundreds have died as a consequence of what the UN has referred to as a fatal game of human ping pong. Effectively, Malaysia refusing to allow people on these boats to dock, pushing them back out to sea. Malaysian authorities have justified this on the basis that boats risk bringing in COVID-19 instead of a different approach, which would of course be to focus on the international human rights standards and obligations to protect life and provide access to asylum and healthcare. And I think that really highlights a broader question and a broader challenge, really, and that is that governments can and must adhere to fundamental human rights obligations under international law to ensure that public health measures do not compromise or violate these rights, but rather protect them, including through mitigation strategies. I just wanted to finally finish on the local dimension on the domestic front and what's happening in Australia. And while I think it's fair to say that what's happening in Australia might not be as stark as some of the examples that I just provided, the challenges and the risks are there. They're still there. On the domestic front, I think it's clear that we're not all in this together when it comes to asylum seekers, refugees, and migrants. The truth is there are vulnerable people in our community who've been left behind, and who are not able to access basic supports. particularly, I think this is in the realms of healthcare, income support, detention and visa status. And the reality is that highly vulnerable groups have been left behind and denied access to critical healthcare and the means to sustain themselves. So highly vulnerable groups have been left behind, including people seeking asylum on bridging visas and temporary visa holders, including refugees and temporary migrant workers. So I think, you know, what we're experiencing here is something that is a global phenomenon, and that is that when we leave some out, we inevitably endanger the health of all of us, and individual health is dependent on collective health and is putting people at risk of ill health or death. And I think we're seeing that very graphically in Australia. Just a couple of final points on that. One is that in relation to healthcare, people seeking asylum in the community in this country, there are people seeking asylum who are without access to Medicare. So there is no universal grant of Medicare in the context of the pandemic, despite many attempts to get a shift on this. And that puts people at greater risk, and all of us at greater risk. Access to healthcare is effectively, in relation to Medicare, is on the arbitrary basis of visa status. The second point is income support, and the essence of this is that the access to a safety net to prevent destitution and homelessness is not universal. There is a crisis unfolding in this country at the moment for women and men seeking asylum and other temporary visa holders who, for example, may have lost their jobs, and there are many that have been contacting us and others. The job was their only form of income. They now have no financial safety net. They're not eligible for job seeker payments, and employers can't claim under the JobKeeper scheme. I think the final point that I wanted to refer to is detention, and we're notoriously so, but in this country we have, of course, a policy and laws of mandatory indefinite detention. There are around 14,000 people. Sorry, I beg your pardon, 1,400 people. There are around 1,400 people across Australia who are held in immigration detention, and for whom the health risks of COVID-19 are very significant and serious. They're living in crowded and cramped conditions. Many people in these conditions are petrified of contracting COVID-19. It's impossible, literally impossible, for them to practice standards of physical distancing and isolation required by the general community. Some have very serious health conditions which make them more susceptible to death in this context by COVID-19. And medical experts continue to highlight the significant risks of holding people in detention. The bottom line here is that the government, despite all of the evidence and the heightened risk of contraction of COVID-19 for people held in detention, have not systematically resorted to looking at alternatives of safer accommodation for people thus far.
Great. Thanks, David. Will you remind us of that rather glib phrase that trotted out everywhere, including by the Secretary-General, we're all in this together, is in fact quite disguises the reality that we're absolutely not all in this together. John, Tobin, over to you. What, from your perspective, are some of we've had a range of things raised, international, regional, local already by Elaine and David, but from your perspective, what are the big, or some of the big human rights issues that have been raised in the pandemic?
Thanks, Lorraine. Thanks both to Elaine and David for agreeing to join us today. And also, I think the 135 people who are also online listening, we appreciate your time and effort as well. I think when you hear Elaine speak, you think, wow, nothing's happening in Australia and we've nothing to worry about now. Tend to be focused on how lucky we are and how unlucky others are in other parts of the world. But then you hear David speak and you're reminded that within Australia too, there are very, very discrete and identifiable groups that are also experiencing supreme human rights violations at the moment as well. And I think the challenge in a country like Australia is to start looking at this issue through a human rights lens. I'm not sure we've done that particularly well to this point. If you think about the weekend, we saw some protests in Victoria and Melbourne around the right to protest being used, perhaps legitimately, perhaps not, to challenge the government restrictions on social isolation. We also saw, I think, in an issue worth thinking about more carefully, were protests in Bell Street, Preston, out to the Mantra Hotel, where in fact refugees are being kept and have been kept for some time without access to any freedom or liberty at all. And so what you see, I suppose, is a couple of things. One is a failure to start seeing this issue through a human rights lens locally. Second, I've identified very discrete and vulnerable groups such as refugees and migrants, as David's identified. And to that group, we should also add prisoners. And many of you might know that, in fact, last week, the Victorian Supreme Court made an order that the government undertake an audit, essentially, of corrections to assess the risk of spread of COVID-19 throughout our criminal justice system as well. But other groups as well, the elderly being one, clearly, that are at risk and high exposure as well. So there are particularly vulnerable groups where their rights aren't necessarily framing the discussions about how to respond. And then more broadly, there's a big debate about how, in fact, all of us, including the four of us and others, are confined to our homes, and my children, who are all in the background, being educated at home, and whether, in fact, the interference has been undertaken by the government, both federal and state, to secure our life, our livelihood and our health are, in fact, justifiable in terms of the impact they have on things like freedom of movement, education, and issues around, of course, work and livelihood as well. So I suppose one of the things that for me is really fascinating now is to what extent can Australians and our policymakers and leaders start to think about these issues through the lens of human rights, and how we might actually use that tool and that lens to try and, I suppose, arrive at what Elaine talked about as being proportionate and balanced responses to often really conflicting and challenging times as well. So I won't add anything more at this point in time, Hilary. I think, as I said, compared to what's happening in the Philippines, things aren't nearly as desperate as they might be here. And the biggest highlight for us becomes, you know, the Adelaide Crows breaching social distancing laws. Now, that's a long way from having kids put in cages and coffins at the hands of dictators and autocrats. But we still have real challenges here. And I think that's A, the vulnerable groups, and B, how we conceptualise and frame issues and recognise the role that human rights might have to play in actually achieving a really, I think, sustainable and well-balanced outcome as well.
Okay, thanks very much, John, for that overview of things here. I just want to ask you all, perhaps briefly, because we've got a number of questions mounting up, which on a quick squiz all look fascinating ones. But just sort of highlight for our audience, given these issues, what mechanisms can be used or are useful, if at all, from a human rights perspective to deal with them? John, I might just go in reverse order if I start with you. Like, thinking about the situation right here, what are there mechanisms that are useful, and what are they?
Yeah, so that's the obvious question, isn't it, Hilary? I suppose the obvious answer is to have an enforceable national Charter of Rights or something to that effect. But I think it's actually interesting if you look a bit more deeply about what's actually happening to enable the government to adopt the regulations it's adopting, is that when you do that, you find that, in fact, the ideals around human rights are, in fact, already embedded in much of our legislation. Just to give one example, the Public Health and Wellbeing Act is the basis on which we've declared a state of emergency in Victoria, and the basis on which the Chief Medical Officer has adopted all the regulations regarding us staying at home, not being at work, not being at school, etc. Now, when you look at that act, in fact, the objective is not explained in rights language, but it actually refers to the objective being to achieve the highest attainable standard of public health. Now, that mirrors quite closely the right to the highest attainable standard of health. Legislation also talks about the obligation of government to secure that highest attainable standard of health. So you're seeing a mimicking of what happens under international law, but as we all know, Australia is reluctant to actually embrace that idea of a right to health formally, both at federal or state level. And then when you go through the actual powers that the Chief Medical Officer has, they all completely mimic the same principles that Elaine talked about: proportionality, least restrictive measures, and evidence-based. In other words, if the government's going to restrict our rights to achieve public health objectives, it must do so in ways that are informed by the evidence, have a rational connection, be proportionate to the objective to be achieved, and minimally impair our rights. So ironically, the actual framework we have in this state mimics what I'd say is demanded by international law. What's missing, of course, is a recognition that, in fact, it's a rights-based framework, and it's missing some of the detail about implementation. But what I think is fascinating is that, in fact, evidence-based, proportionate, balanced responses are what's demanded by our legal system as well. And if you think historically, both federal and state level, we don't always find evidence informing our social policy. But ironically, what's happened in this current climate is that we're now seeing, for the large part, both federal and state politicians saying we will defer to the evidence to inform the measures we adopt and take as well. So we can argue about whether the balance has been adopted is correct, but in fact the legislative framework under the Public Health and Wellbeing Act actually supports many of the same principles that a human rights lawyer would say should apply in times like this as well. Great,
thanks, John. David, can you point to even just one example of how there are or there are not remedies in Australian or any other legal system to respond to some of the human rights abuses you identify?
Well, I think it's a tale of limitations, I'm afraid, at the moment. You know, I think the bottom line is the Constitution, the Australian Constitution, is not a great vehicle for you know, for human rights enforcement or indeed challenges, particularly in this context with, you know, the current situation of people being detained, mandatorily detained. I think that, you know, as we know, there are very few rights in the Australian Constitution, and those express rights are very limited. You know, for example, the right to freedom of religion, trial by jury in some circumstances, and there are a number of other implied rights. But I guess that it is, I think, but beyond this, I think there are real limitations in relation to constitutional protections of human rights, as we know, and as John referred to before. This points to the need for a Charter of Human Rights in order to have a stronger and clearer framework for the protection of human rights. A lot of the sort of the human rights norms, if you like, need to require a fairly complex and multidimensional approach in order to, you know, to seek human rights protections in Australia. One of them is through the law, and for example, there has, as people would be aware, there has recently been some work done to challenge the detention of people considered to be at particularly high risk in detention, high risk of contracting COVID-19. The situation with that litigation so far is it has again pointed to real limitations. I think one interesting thing about that litigation, though, that sort of illustrates the limitations is that the arguments have not been able to be framed directly as human rights arguments drawing upon human rights principles, because we don't have a charter. Rather, they've been brought using sort of the general law, if you like, the law of negligence, as a sort of as a necessary tool to challenge, you know, the potential breach of a duty, or indeed the risk of harm to someone, you know, both I guess to their you know, to their health, but also to their liberty. It's much more focused on health. So I think that really this points to the real limitations of the law in this context. It's not to say that it shouldn't be drawn upon, and it has been and will be, and we and others have been involved in that. But I think also it points to the need for approaches that go beyond the law and involve particularly civil society calling for change. And I think that right at the heart of all of this, I think, lies the fundamental importance of the approach being one that's inclusive, equitable and universal in relation to protections of people and in relation to the response to COVID-19. And really, the fundamental problem that we see globally and in Australia is that we're not all in this together, quite manifestly so. We need to be, really, if I could put it this way, there has been a paradigm shift globally in relation to the way in which we live and work. There has been a corresponding paradigm shift by governments in relation to their responses nationally and globally, with very limited exceptions. And one of those exceptions has been in the area of the response to asylum seekers, refugees and migrants, where we've seen anything but a paradigm shift. Instead, what we've seen is really a reinforcement, if you like, an intensification and exacerbation of existing discrimination and harm. And I think that that's why I come back to this point that in civil society and in the work that's done within civil society to call for an equitable, inclusive and universal response, it's fundamental that particularly vulnerable groups and potentially special measures be introduced to ensure that they also are protected. For two reasons. One, because of their own rights, and also because of the collective importance, the shared collective responsibility in this.
Great, thanks, David. And Elaine, from your perspective, what are the mechanisms, if any, that could be used to respond to some of these issues?
I'm just listening to David talking a bit about the role of civil society. I mean, I totally agree. I think civil society in Australia has done a great job at pointing out exactly who is slipping through the safety net and who is most vulnerable to the rights violations associated with COVID. If you look around our region in Southeast Asia, you know, even before the COVID crisis, civil society was under threat because activists are being rounded up, detained, journalists, you know, are in some cases being attacked or silenced. I mean, just last week in the Philippines, you had one of the major TV networks taken off the air because of Duterte's campaign of intimidation against the media. So I think the question then becomes, okay, so what can we do in these countries where we don't have a strong, resilient civil society and where we want to support the people in those countries who are facing these attacks? And that's where I think it's really important for governments like Australia to really step it up. And, you know, Australia is a democracy. It's a middle power country. It has a seat on the Human Rights Council. It has a lot of mechanisms that it could be pushing for, you know, not only to push for an international investigation into the origins of the pandemic, but it should also be, you know, pushing for support for human rights defenders in these countries who are now themselves the subject of attack. And I think that's something that we'd really like to see in Australia's foreign policy. You know, we see on paper the government saying, yes, human rights is part of our foreign policy. And yet time and again, you know, we see human rights, you know, really in the background when it comes to trade and security relationships with these countries. So, you know, we think it's actually really important that, you know, countries really band together that are concerned about these problems and really try and, you know, take these countries to task for these abuses. Because, you know, as David said, we are all in this together. And, you know, if we can't get a hold, you know, on this virus in the countries in our region, then that's actually also going to be really bad for Australia. So, you know, I think it's also about standing up for our colleagues in civil society countries who are really, you know, facing the brunt of these attacks and who are being censored and silenced when they try to raise concerns about these abuses.
And Elaine, just to follow up there, from where you sit, what's your assessment of how active has the Australian government said much on these issues with respect to human rights defenders in other countries, or what has been, how have they done in the last couple of months on that issue?
Look, I think DFAT has been primarily concerned with bringing back Australian citizens who are in trouble overseas. And, you know, look, I understand that obviously should be a priority of foreign affairs. But I think a lot of these issues have really, you know, fall to the sidelines. And I think where we have, you know, ambassadors that are doing a good job, you know, in these countries working on issues that affect Australians, it's also equally important that they're standing up on these issues. And no, we haven't seen any statements, for instance, with regard to what's been happening in the Philippines, whereas we have seen statements coming out of the EU and, you know, certain other governments. So I think there's definitely more work for Australia to do in raising these concerns.
Thank you. Now, thanks to our invisible audience out there who are sending in some fantastic questions. So keep them coming through the Q&A function. But I might focus on a couple which several people have asked. And this is to all the panel. But I just say to the panel, we have so many questions, fantastic ones pouring in. Perhaps you might answer these fairly succinctly. So a number of our participants have asked, how might this pandemic catalyse a move towards stronger human rights protections in Australia? So could this event push states and federal government to support a charter? Can I just squeeze in a sort of variation of that too, perhaps particularly for John? Do you think that the states in Australia, the states and territories in Australia that do have some form of human rights protection, like Victoria's Charter of Human Rights, have you observed any difference in the way those states responded to the pandemic from the states like New South Wales, without a human rights charter? Or is it too early to say? But that's a question to everybody. Might this be a positive catalysing event? But John, do you think there's any water in the idea that states in Australia that have some human rights instruments are doing better, or no sign at all?
I'd like to say the answer is yes, but I don't think I've got enough evidence to make that conclusion. And if you look broadly at the observations, also the measures taken by each jurisdiction, they're very similar. What I think is interesting, though, is to the broader question, could it catalyse it? I think yes. I think what we're seeing here, ironically, is that the Australian governments, both federally, state, territory, have all recognised that when a crisis like this hits, it's the obligation of the state to step in and take the measures to respond. And if you compare it with something like what's happening in America, where the response has been very fragmented and very different, and I'd say not evidence-based or informed or proportionate at all, I think what I take away from this is that if Australia does actually recognise, Australian governments recognise their role in protecting lives and livelihood and balancing that against education, social security, housing, and providing supports, as they have $140 billion, then that's really affecting what a rights-based model would demand as well. And so if that model works, and it's working, we're one of the most successful models in the world, then the fears we have about using those principles that Elaine mentioned, proportionality, least restrictive measures, etc., they should start to become less of a concern for those seeking to actually agitate for a federal charter of rights, but also a charter that includes economic, social and cultural rights. No government in this country is saying we want people to go hungry, to be homeless, to be without education. They're all saying, on the contrary, we want them to have a job, we want them to be able to have housing, we want them to be able to go to school. They're all things that a charter would demand as well. And so I think there is a real opportunity here to move out of this crisis and saying, if we use the same model we've used to address what's been happening in Australia, and the side mark is vulnerable groups like refugees, then in fact we can strengthen the case for a national charter and, importantly, the inclusion of economic, social and cultural rights, which we've been so scared of for such a long time. But in fact, we're now spending $140 billion plus to actually secure and protect as well. And no one's saying that's a bad thing. Everyone's saying it's a good thing on both sides of politics.
Great, thanks, John. David, what's your, to the big question, might this end up being a good thing for human rights?
Well, it could be. It does present some real opportunities. I mean, my central concern is the one that I mentioned before, that we've seen a paradigm shift in many respects, which has been, in many cases, very positive, despite the extraordinary challenges globally that we've been discussing. There have been some very good examples of, for example, as John mentioned, state intervention, which is necessary, and has really been state intervention which has again been seen a major paradigm shift. For example, to put it simply, that it's a paradigm shift in many states from neoliberalism to state intervention in ways that would have several months ago been unthinkable. I think stimulus packages like we've seen in Australia and globally in many countries would have been unthinkable several months ago, and yet they have these mammoth stimulus packages have been brought. I think that though what we do see, as I mentioned, is some exceptions, and I think the real question is particularly in those areas of exception, and human rights so often, it shouldn't, but it often does end up focusing on particular areas or particular groups. I mean, it should be universal, and as we know, but I think that where the concern lies, and I think it's both opportunities but also challenges, is with particularly vulnerable groups, and whether in the sort of post-pandemic era, we can see whether the case becomes clearer for more universal protection and better protection. I think where it needs to start actually is with social and economic rights. I think that, and particularly in the area of health, I think what we've seen so graphically is that discrimination of some affects us all, those people and all of us. And I think it's through that we see, I think, a potentially very powerful case for, and I guess that's through the guarantee of the right to health, the Sustainable Development Goals, etc. Through that movement, I think that there is some potential progress that could be made. I think that needs to be the starting point, though, through health, and I think also, and I think that there is a human rights argument here about sort of risk reduction and risk management, which could have major benefits in terms of people's, protection of people's human rights. I also think in terms of access to other areas, socially, in relation to social and economic policy, I think that there are some major opportunities, again, going back to the collective shared responsibility, the importance of it. But I do see also some real challenges on that front. I just wanted to point to one thing. We have already seen some, and we haven't mentioned this today, but some sort of internationally, some good practices too in this context. And one of them in the area, the asylum seeker, refugee and migrant area that I think is particularly important is examples like Portugal, where there was intervention to grant status to people, to people in vulnerable situations, to grant a sort of universal status to people. And I think that there are, if those kind of good practices could be harnessed, I think that we could see some real development. But I think that we live in a precarious world, and this pandemic hasn't occurred in a vacuum, as we know, with the sort of major challenges of climate change, of unprecedented forced displacement and escalating inequality. So I think the challenges are great.
Great. Elaine, what's your take on the big question? Might we gain something from this?
I hope so. I really do. I mean, I was thinking a bit about how, the people who were coming back from overseas were detained in the hotels and were complaining, about the prison-like conditions in those hotels, and then reflecting on the fact that, maybe they will be the future advocates for the people in detention who, have been facing those conditions for months, in some cases years. I mean, if you look at, the guys from the refugees from Manne and Nauru who've been detained in the Mantra hotels in Melbourne and in Brisbane, I mean, some of them have been there for 9 months in those conditions. And I think, one of the problems is that people have almost become so used to this. Oh, well, this is happening to refugees. Oh, this is happening to prisoners. This is happening to other people. But I think this experience of this pandemic, we've all experienced, different types of lockdown and isolation. So I would hope that, I guess, the empathy then that we would feel for vulnerable people who are in these conditions is increased. But, really, if we want to see real progress, I think, on human rights issues here and globally, it's really going to take, a movement of people who are really committed to these issues. And unfortunately, with the Bill of Rights issue, we just haven't seen that sort of mass mobilization. I think human rights has, unfortunately been relegated to, the rights of these people over there, but people haven't seen how it impacts on their daily lives. Well, now we're actually seeing how it is so important and how it impacts all of our lives.
One interesting strand in the questions that I can see is some people raising the issue about misuse of human rights language. So that one of the questions is, well, if people are talking about, there has been discussion in Victoria until I think midnight tonight, you can't play golf, and there has been some talk by politicians and others of, a human right to play golf. And one of the questions is, well, have we, what's happening to the human rights community if the language of human rights can be hijacked, as it were, to talk about a human right to play golf? I just leave it out there in case you want to take it up. But let me ask another question that's coming up time and time again. John and Elaine specifically have pointed to this already, but taking it to a more general level, it's often said by human rights lawyers, well, of course, in times of emergency, there can be restrictions on human rights. There's this critical issue, though, the proportionality has to be observed. And a number of our audience today are interested in, well, how do we measure proportionality? If we concede that human rights aren't absolute, that there will be necessary restrictions on them, and we say the principle of proportionality must apply, can we break that down a bit so that people can understand what does it mean to be proportional, and how would you use those tests to assess some of the restrictions both in Australia and overseas that have been used. So, John, perhaps can I first, what's your take on how would you, proportionality, lawyers love that language, but what for
keep it simple.
General community, how do we understand it?
Keep it simple. I'm actually teaching a master's course next week for 5 days. So if anyone wants to enroll, we'll spend 5 days talking about proportionality essentially. But it really goes to the nub of what we're trying to do here to try and balance competing rights or interests. I'll keep it as simple as possible. If anyone out there wants to try and make an assessment of whether the things they're confronting are in fact a proportionate interference with their rights, there are sort of 3 central questions. One, is it law, or is it legal? Is there a law that allows it to be done? In Australia, there are laws passed federally and state that actually allow for restrictions to be in place. So legality is a tick. Second question is, does that restriction or interference with your right, whether it's education, work, privacy, family life, does it pursue a legitimate aim? And the answer would be yes, the aim is public health. That's a tick under both the Public Health and Wellbeing Act and also a tick under international law, which allows for restrictions to secure public health interests and rights. And the third one's where the debate takes place. And that really is, well, are the measures proportionate? And essentially, the easiest way to think about that is through 2 lenses. Is there a rational connection between the measure taken and the objective taught? So is there evidence to support the aim of public health by restricting your movement with your friends, your attendance at work, etc.? So is that rational connection satisfied? Issue of necessity. And the last one goes to the question of, I suppose, the principle of minimal impairment. Are there other ways that the government could have achieved the aim by imposing less restrictions or minimal restrictions on your particular right in question? So those sort of criteria, law, legitimate aim, the idea of being necessary and being proportionate become really fundamental. So anyone can undertake those quite quickly. And I'll just throw one out as being obvious. Clearly going to work and mixing with colleagues, there's evidence that it's really bad, or going to a nightclub or a bar or a cafe, transmission rates are very high. The ones where it gets more controversial would be, for example, with schools right now in Victoria, where the evidence isn't conclusive. We perhaps can't debate that now, but it's uncertain that children are in fact very efficient at transmitting the disease, which is a good thing from my perspective, but there's still debate there. So is there evidence to support the restriction of attendance? But an even a more sort of interesting one to think about and ponder is, should L-platers been forbidden from driving around during Zone 3 restrictions? And I make that not to make light of it, but to demonstrate the issue about, well, what objective is being met there by saying that a parent can't take their 17-year-old for a drive in a car where no one's actually exposed to anything at all. Now, I don't want to muddy the waters, but to demonstrate that's how that test can play out. The point that I want to end, of course, here is in situations like this as a crisis, we can in fact have large-scale derogations from human rights. And in the European context, that's actually happening right now. Quite a few European states have derogated from the European Convention. That's not a language you have in Victoria, but there's an awareness within human rights law that you can suspend rights in times of crisis as well. But that proportionality assessment, I think, is the fundamental thing. So Elaine and David might have some other thoughts on that as well. So I'll hand over to them.
I have only one observation, and that is that that I've always understood proportionality to be underpinned by fundamental aim of protection. So that protection of people and their human dignity must always be central in that proportionality. That's the sort of framework. And I think that where things so often go wrong or very wrong is where you know, the consequence for people and the protection of people becomes absent effectively in the equation.
Right.
And can I just add as well, David? So the Secretary General, the first point in that guideline says exactly that the number one priority is protecting lives and livelihoods. That's where the conversation starts. Yep.
So the best example I can think of, and it's sort of why I sort of raised in part why I raised the Rohingya example earlier, was that there is a graphic illustration of the failure of the state to apply that principle. There are clearly other ways in which they could, you know, one obvious example is that Malaysia, instead of just saying, well, it's contrary to our border protection measures and in a public health crisis, and therefore we're just going to turn you back to sea with an inevitable consequence that some people will perish. Instead, of course, they could allow that boat to dock and bring people into some form of quarantine and other measures that would protect their health and others, but they didn't.
Thanks. Elaine.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've largely agreed with what John and David have said, but I think, all over the place, these questions are being asked now because certain people, feel like the measures that are being taken are disproportionate. And so I think it's really about ensuring that there are ways to, check that the implementation of these measures are not arbitrary, are not discriminatory in how they're being applied. And particularly, I guess, where, certain measures are being applied to ensure that sometimes people have the right to legally challenge those measures. So, for instance, there's been some cases in New Zealand, I know recently, where people recently returned from overseas have been prevented from seeing dying relatives. And, they were told, well, no, because you haven't actually, waited out the 14 days of quarantine. But a court subsequently, overturned that, based on the evidence that, there was the possibility for someone to be able to visit their relatives, after spending a shorter time in quarantine, and obviously using other measures to ensure the safety, of themselves and their relative. So I think it's about ensuring that those measures are in place to look for, particularly the arbitrary and the discriminatory enforcement.
A sort of specific question has been asked by a couple of participants about precisely this issue in the context of places of detention in Australia, something David's spoken about, saying, well, if we, given the fact that there's so little external oversight of those places, how would we even ever be able to assess whether what's going on there is proportional or not? I don't know if any of you would like to comment on that point, which seems pretty accurate to me.
Very accurate. There is, in fact, in Australia, somewhat shockingly, there is no sort of detailed legislative framework, accountability framework for immigration detention in this country, unlike with prisons, where there is in this country. And from that flow many dire consequences, and one of them is exactly what the person that's asked the question is pointing to, and that is when it comes to accountability. And I'll give you a very simple example. We continue to hear from successive governments that there is a framework for the review of people's detention, regardless of laws which governments continue to maintain allow for mandatory indefinite detention. They say that there is a review framework. There's no evidence to date, after years and years of attempting to get detail, there's no evidence that that framework and the actual reviews in substance for individuals occur in any particular way, which would look at their particular circumstances and whether it's necessary and appropriate to hold them in detention. It's all left to effectively administrative action and policy rather than accountability under law. So, how do we know? Well, even getting access at the moment to speak to the right person who is working in detention is a struggle for many lawyers. I can tell you, being able to speak to someone who may have authority in relation to the conditions of someone that they're representing can present significant difficulties itself.
Thank you. Thanks, David. We've had a number of questions on the specific issue of people with a disability. So if any of you would like to weigh in on the question of what's your assessment of how in Australia particularly, or other examples if you're aware of them, how have the particular situations of people with a disability been included, if at all, in discourse about COVID-19? And so the specific question of the human rights of people with disability, I don't know if you've got observations.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just bringing it back to the custodial settings. I mean, we put out a report 2 years ago looking at prisoners with disabilities, of which more than half the prison population in Australia has a disability, if you include mental health conditions, psychosocial disabilities. Now, we are very concerned that given now the lack of scrutiny of places of detention, the lack of visitors, the fact that prisoners are now spending far more time under lockdown. In some places, you know, it's up to 21, 22 hours per day. It's those prisoners with disabilities who are going to be much more vulnerable. They're much more vulnerable to abuse by other prisoners, in some cases also by prison staff. They're much more likely to be bullied. They're much more likely not to be believed, and they're not going to deal well with extended periods of lockdown and, you know, inadequate mental health support services, which frankly, even before the coronavirus, you know, were largely inadequate, but now, you know, are virtually non-existent. So I think this is really a challenge for us. And that's just, you know, I guess people with disabilities in the prison system. I don't know if John or David want to add more about, you know, people with disabilities outside of prisons.
Yeah, can I just add there as well? So I think the second point on the Secretary General's list is that the virus doesn't discriminate, but its effects do. And so a rights-based approach has to be fashioned in a way which identifies and recognises that certain groups are much more vulnerable in terms of the effects of COVID-19. And disabilities is clearly one in the educational sector, where there's a real challenge in delivering educational services to young children who may have been at schools for children with disabilities as well. And so this is a real challenge about how we allocate those additional resources to adjust and assist both those children and their families as well. So imagine situations where there may have been respite for a child with some serious disabilities. Those parents no longer have that respite. That then gives rise to risks around a whole range of issues for both the parents and the child as well. So I think the point to highlight here is that if you're serious about using a human rights framework, it's recognising that the effects will not be uniform. They'll be very, very different. And there's a need to adopt special measures to assist and protect the rights of those particular groups, whether it be in prisons, in schools, refugee detention centres. All those groups require additional protection as well. And then I think sometimes get lost in the midst when we're worrying about, you know, the things that are affecting us as well. So I think it's a really important point to raise.
I think that the principle really is one of continuity of support being guaranteed, and if it's inadequate, that it be improved.
Thank you. I'm conscious that the time is racing by. We could go for double this time easily. Fiona Magecki, hi Fiona, from UWA has sent an interesting question. She's noted that not many states seem to have formally derogated from their obligations under the ICCPR, for example, under the Major Human Rights Covenant, and yet clearly and often understandably, she says, are breaching provisions. Do any of you have thoughts on that issue? Why would countries not formally derogate from their obligations under the ICCPR? Because we know that, for example, under the European Convention on Human Rights, a number of states, not all European states by any means, have made formal derogations. Do any of you have a take on that interesting formal legal issue?
I think the answers would depend on each state in question. And I suppose if you're thinking it through a cynical perspective, it would be that those states in question haven't derogated because they don't really care sufficiently to worry about compliance with the obligations under the ICCPR. So it depends on a case-by-case basis. My guess is cynicism is probably what explains what's happened there. But, you know, a more generous interpretation might be that they think they can in fact comply with the standards. And I think you could, by and large. Keep in mind, derogations still require necessity, proportionality, time-bound measures as well. So they're not that dissimilar to the internal limitations clauses that exist as well. But my guess is it's probably a lack of respect for international human rights law, but I could be speaking out of turn. Elaine might have some more insights on that issue as well.
Well, given that time is almost upon us, can I get you each in perhaps half a minute or less? What is one thing that could be done to promote a human rights approach to the pandemic? One achievable thing that we could lobby politicians or others to do. Elaine, can I start with you?
Yeah, reduce the number of people in custodial settings. I mean, we've seen other countries around the world do this. I mean, in Indonesia, they've reduced the number of people in prisons. because of the concerns in overcrowded, places. Obviously there's, concern that the pandemic can spread. In Australia, we actually haven't seen any measures taken yet. And that's despite the fact that we have had reported cases of, guards working in certain facilities that have tested positive. And so I think, really measures need to be taken to reduce the number of people in prisons, in immigration detention centres and other places, where people are much more vulnerable to COVID.
Thanks, Elaine. David?
Well, I would say that measures need to be taken to ensure that we are in fact all in this together, not just in rhetoric but in reality, and that would include not only what Elaine mentioned, and that is ensuring that we don't have a series of land-based ruby princesses, detention centres that is, where people remain trapped in high-risk conditions, but rather look at safe alternatives. I would just add to that is to ensure that there is universal application of income and income support and a basic safety net and universal access to Medicare and medical treatment.
Great. Quite modest demands there, David. John, over to you.
Look, I echo both those calls. I think vulnerable groups, particularly in prisons and refugee communities, are the most obvious targets where they're missing out. For people like me, it's not nearly as challenging at all. What I'd like to see, I suppose, is an awareness that in fact, from politicians and leaders and policymakers, that human rights can offer us a model that actually helps us balance competing priorities and reduce the burden that's experienced by vulnerable groups, and then hopefully demonstrate that model can be used in other contexts as well. That might be asking far too much, but we haven't heard a lot of language of rights from our leaders, whether that's because they don't want to use it or because they don't think it's relevant. But I think, if we want to knock the right to golf arguments into their place, then that conversation has to be had in an honest, transparent way. And I think now's the time to have it. I think it's a really good opportunity to be really, courageous, honest and open and having a debate about human rights in this country, and what that actually means and entails. If we're prepared to spend 140 billion in incurred deficits for the next 3 or 4 years, then we're prepared to think hard about the place of things like the right to health, education, housing, and a livelihood for all Australians, as David has said, not just for some. That would be my small challenge, which might be a bit unrealistic, but that's what it'll be.
Not at all. Well, look, I'd just before I thank everybody, I'd just like to say that the next webinar in this series, Law in the Time of COVID, is on Thursday at the same time, Labour Law Enforcement and COVID-19, and that's going to be moderated by my colleague, Professor John Howe, with panellists Dr. Tess Hardy of Melbourne Law School, Juan Tran and Stephen Amendola. So that promises to be a wonderful webinar, and we encourage you to sign on for that. But I'd like to thank, first of all, our backroom people, Dr. Shane Chalmers and Abigail Parker, for helping with moderating the wonderful questions, summarising the wonderful questions we've had and sending them through. And finally, on behalf of all of you, I'd like to thank our fantastic panelists today. Thank you very much for their time. Elaine Pearson from Human Rights Watch, the Australia Director, David Manne, the indefatigable CEO of Refugee Legal, and my wonderful colleague, John Tobin, who managed to get a plug in there for a course next week. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and for leaving us with a lot to worry about, but I think some very hopeful words there too. Thank you very much.